mic'd up and working? Can you all hear me? Oh, yeah, I can hear it now. Thank you. Well, thank you. It's so great to be back in Louisville. Currently, I'm in Lexington. The program I run is in Lexington, but it's a real honor to have an opportunity to talk to you. And I'm going to try to pack about 3 hours worth of presentation in 30 minutes. So to be able to help you best assess what happens with intimate partner violence in your careers. And I need to tell you how critical it is. Last year in the state of Kentucky, 50 men, women, and children were murdered by a family member as part of intimate partner violence. And every one of them had access to medical care, even though most domestic violence survivors say that 80% of the time nobody has asked them or helped them assess what their relationship has been. So they access medical care all the time for different health issues, mental health issues, where often the issues of intimate partner violence are overlooked. And so my goal today is just to give you some basic guidelines, insights that you could help implement, make sure that you're aware of, kind of think about, and I hope to do it a little bit through a different lens. I really focus on batters and batters' behaviors because I don't believe that any of us who get up every day to help and serve others to make them well and whole can do that if we don't understand batters and batters' behaviors. I can't help a survivor if I don't know what batters are capable of in their complexity and how easily they manipulate their partners. And you all probably experience a lot of that when they come to see you and you are curious about whether or not a survivor may be a victim of intimate partner violence. Survivors are quite keen at not being able to recognize themselves sometimes, their own danger that they're in. They often are not aware that they're a victim of anything because what we typically look for in most of our fields is that of physical violence, but not always assessing the other types of abuse that lead to physical violence potentially over time and the threat to human life. So with that, most of you have had that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but batters' key strengths in manipulation is the beginning process they do is they groom their survivor. So nobody goes into a relationship understanding potentially the consequences or how that batterer is going to act in the long run. What batterers do is they are great in the beginning. They are caring and they're loving and they're gentle and they take time to learn their partner. They learn their strengths and their weaknesses. They look at their vulnerabilities. There's a lot of trust established, a lot of hope that this relationship is going to be healthy. Once a commitment is made is when we begin to see batters' behaviors begin to change regarding the relationship. And how they do that is pretty subtle in the beginning. It's often through typical arguments or disagreements. But in most of us that have healthy relationships or pretty healthy relationships, those don't usually result in name callings and degradations. They usually are supportive in helping people become the best they can be in a relationship. And what an abuser will do is they really work hard to degrade, put down, humiliate, dehumanize their partner as part of this process. Now, what you and I don't see is the day-to-day impact. You know, by the time they come see us or they come see you and maybe even to disclose some of what they've experienced, they are telling us about an inch of the reality of what they have, and often themselves can't even put into context what their relationship and how it's unfolded and how serious of a situation it may be. That's why a lot of times survivors will be in a relationship 25 years, but it won't be the last 10 where they begin to realize things that they had no control and then they really have been powerless, because the first 15 through these dynamics, you know, batterers give power to survivors sometimes, and it becomes confusing and it feels equitable until what happens over a period of time is batters become more serious, more engaged, and more dangerous. And that's when survivors begin to identify. We can speed that process. You can speed that process through questions, through understanding. When survivors just have conversations, we should always be talking about their relationships and who they're with and what affects their day in and day out progress or process in their world. So how they do that is they use a lot of intimidation. They use put-downs. Often there's pieces of the name-calling. What's most famous is the isolation. Survivors do a really good job at making the children and the non-offending partner to be loyal to the batterer. You've all heard of the hostage syndrome, right? Like, how do you identify with the people that harm you? Often survivors are the ones that defend their partners, make excuses for their partners. I was with a woman yesterday, and her spouse has been very abusive, and he was caught driving intoxicated with the children in the car. And, she just wants him to get help. She wants him to quit drinking, because if he quits drinking, then he won't be violent or use violence anymore. And that's not true. Alcohol does not cause people to be violent. There's lots of people that drink who don't use violence. But in her mind frame, she's still in the sense of loyalty, because batterers create their survivors to be loyal to them. So when we, the helpers, are trying to help them see that it's not healthy and not okay, we've got to give a little grace to know that most survivors are going to come in and out of these relationships 6 or 7 times before they're able to finally have clarity and begin to break the chains. Also, the most dangerous time, when you look at how batterers use power and control, the most dangerous time for a survivor is when they leave. Even though those of us, as a community, as a society, really want survivors to be able to break free of these relationships for themselves and their children, that is when they are at greatest risk. So of the 50 men, women, and children who were killed this past year, there was not one situation of where somebody was killed that they were still actively together. All of those situations were people who were parting, had just filed protective orders or divorces, or had separated from their partner. So we have to be cautious and careful, which I'll talk to you a little bit about. But this is how they gain their power and manipulation over a period of time. And one of the most powerful tools is the use of children to keep people. The one thing I can't tell you about intimate partner violence is which batterer will kill and which one won't. So I have to look at it and encourage you all to look at every situation as potentially lethal, because we don't know. And there are people that surprise us. There are times I've wanted to block the doors and not let people leave our program because I'm so afraid for their safety, who absolutely are still walking the face of the earth. And there are people who I thought were free and out of it and doing really well who are not. So for us, we really have to think about how we assess and how we ask the questions. And I know you all are busy. And sometimes even those of us in the field, we can get a little hurried in the work. But it's important that your offices, your hospitals, wherever you have influence, your practice, your nursing practice, has some series of questions that you absolutely ask everybody. And this is why it's important, because there are different types of batterers. And if it's a cobra batterer, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute, but they are the hardest to identify versus a bully type batterer, which is the pit bull batterer. And if you don't ask everybody the question, the victims at most risk for lethality will never be assessed. So the questions that need to be on every questionnaire, when people come to your offices and fill out that paperwork the first time. Now, I go to the doctor all the time. And I can be, honestly, I almost never have to answer a question about my relationship. And then when people find out what I do, they assume that I can never be a victim of intimate partner violence, since I've been doing this for 30 years. But that assumption, could really do harm in the long run. A lot of survivors hide behind their professional status. They are grateful that you're not going to ask them the question. So we need to be sure that we're consistent. So we have to ask these. Do you feel afraid of your partner? Are you afraid of angering? Do you change your behavior? Do you feel that nothing you do is good enough for your partner? Are you constantly criticized? Do you fear being mistreated? You don't ask a potential domestic violence survivor if they're a victim of domestic violence, because they're going to say no. But these subtle ways of getting to the issues, that it's not okay, is a safer avenue for survivors if they begin to process. Here's the other reason it's important is a lot of survivors don't identify the survivors. And you start asking questions, and then they start going, well, wait a minute, maybe my relationship is not. It's easy to pick out your relationship if you're being physically assaulted all the time. But the vast majority of survivors who are underserved are not being physically assaulted. They're being emotionally, mentally, verbally, economically abused day in and day out, and so are the children as part of that, and easy to cover up. Do you feel numb and helpless? Do you get, does your partner humiliate you? Does he yell at you? Does he do it in front of people? Does he put you down? Has it always been in the home, not just in public? Does he ignore you, put you down? These subtleties are another ways to help survivors begin to question the healthiness of their relationship. That's not us labeling them as a victim of anything. It's not my job to label people. It's my job to give an avenue for people to begin to process how their relationship is and what it looks like. Does your partner have bad and unpredictable temper? Have you ever been threatened? Has they threatened to kill you, to harm you? As you can see, these are things that are starting to escalate. So early on, people might go, well, it's not that bad there. I've never been forced to have sex, so therefore I'm not abused. You can't just ask these 5 questions without the others, because we know that intimate partner violence becomes more serious and severe over time. So if they're in the early stages, we'll miss them if we jump right to the more serious issues. We also know that questions about forced sex without labeling it as rape, as most survivors of rape won't label if it's an intimate partner as rape. But forced sex, even though it is considered sexual assault in the state of Kentucky, is important for survivors to realize that they may be a victim as well. So does your partner have jealousy, possessiveness, control where you go, what you do? These are all ways that batters use power and control to control the family. But the questions that you ask are ways that you can address it without survivors feeling overly protective necessarily. Does that make sense? So we have different types of batters, and we need to know that, because what happens mostly with survivors is they believe that you're not going to believe them. Greatest fear of a survivor is when I start telling what's really happening to me, I'm going to be dismissed. If you think about the Me Too movement and how people have rallied around to support survivors who've come forth, men, women, and children, in that situation, it's been very empowering and emboldening for survivors to begin to tell their stories, because what's kept it suppressed for so long for many is the fact that we won't believe what really their experience has been, or that will be dismissed, especially depending on who our batterer is and what my role is in the community. So here's the thing you need to know. Batterers are really hard to profile. They are not necessarily mentally ill, although we have mentally ill batterers, absolutely. Most batterers are very high functioning. They go to work every day. They perform. They pay bills like everybody else. They're living in, middle class incomes or upper middle class incomes, especially if they're Cobra batterers. They are highly functioning. And so for that survivor, those survivors are more isolated than any other survivor, and they are the most missed and the most likely to die from intimate partner violence. And they also stay the longest in these relationships. Survivors who are physically assaulted repeatedly and frequently leave those relationships much earlier. Those of a Cobra batter, the one that has we have to know that they come in a full range. Sometimes we have this box that we want to put people in. It's easy. My nephew about 10 years ago said something. He was watching a movie. You know how they call things that wife beater shirt? Right? Everybody calls them wife beaters, or like tank tops kind of things. Which, by the way, he doesn't use that language anymore because he's my nephew. However, but in his lens, that's how it was portrayed by media, that people who abused were low income, they were poor, they wore cowboy boots. There was actually research that verified that. I think it was done in Texas, which doesn't count. That men that wore cowboy boots were more likely to be violent than men that didn't. It has nothing to do with that, but there's research that says there is. But that was his lens. right? And I think that becomes society's lens of how it's portrayed to us, because it can't be us, it can't be ours, it can't be people who have education or more wealth or more security, and that's absolutely a falsity. Those living in higher incomes are just as much at risk as lower incomes. The difference is lower incomes are easier to identify because lower incomes have nowhere else to go but to ask for help, where other people have the ability to hide. So if we put batterers in a box, and the reason it's easier to put batterers in a box too, and it's part of my challenge is why everybody needs assessment, is the reason it's easy is because batterers are often people at our own Thanksgiving tables, right? They are people we know. They have been our colleagues. They have been co-students with us. They might be family members, might be a grandfather, might be a great uncle. Most all of us know people who have not treated their partners with dignity and respect and have been abusive and manipulative and hurtful to their families. But yet, we find room for them in our lives. But if you step on the other side, and it's okay, we all do it. We all make room for those people in our lives. But you have to look through the lens of the other side of what power that gives if a survivor tries to step away from that, and whether or not we believe. So we have a tendency as professionals to put it in the box we're most comfortable with, instead of understanding that batterers have a full range of personality types. They are very difficult to profile. If you put them in the box, you're going to be wrong and you're going to miss the survivor. They often test psychologically very, very well, which makes them credible in courtrooms and child custody cases and through divorce cases. When survivors are trying to tell their stories of what their experience has been, it's often dismissed even through the court process. Outside acquaintances do not perceive the abuser as abusive. This individual can be well-liked, well-respected individual. So that minimizes the victim's experience of being able to break free and be believed and having the support that they need. And then the children and the non-offending partner are exposed to behaviors that they all hide from others. So how a batterer is in the home is much different than how they are in public. I have no idea what I did. Oh, there we go. Sorry. I guess I wanted you all to look at me instead of that. Most batterers will convince you all, the partners. So one of the part of your assessment is not just to ask the questions, but what we also know is batterers will come to appointments with people. Batterers will beat somebody up and then drive them to the hospital, assault them, threaten them all the way, and tell them the story that they have to tell the hospital personnel, the nurses, the intake, whatever. And then they're really good at playing the victim. It is important that when you ask these questions that survivors have spaces. It is not okay to hand a survivor with their partner these list of 20 questions that they have to answer right in front of the partner. These questions that you're going to ask or add to assessment really need to be done when they're back in the room without the partner. Or if you have the ability, if you have any reason to suspect something's going on, the ability to say, can you wait outside until we do this and then bring the other person in later. Privacy is very important for survivors to be able to answer questions and begin to process their experiences. But most batterers are great at playing the victim. They view resistance by the victim as an act of aggression, and the children, they become the enemy. And the more if survivors try to leave and become the enemy because they're trying to take their power back, is the more dangerous of a time that creates for both them and their children. They are skilled at convincing other people that they are the victim. And they're great at victimology because they utilize the behavior to control others, so they know it really well. And they're able to twist that back and play the victim in these situations. And again, most have no psychological problems. And that most battering is pretty much driven culturally rather than individual psychology. And also for many, many years, there was a belief that if you grew up in a violent home, that you were either going to be a victim or a batterer. And all the research now lends to the fact that's not accurate. It's really more of a societal issue in learning and validation, much more than a learned behavior. Not that it can't be a learned behavior. What we do know is that most men are not batterers, but that most batterers are men. And it's not to say men are not victims. All of our programs serve men, women, and children and very much identify male victimization, especially in LGBTQ. And that's another isolated population who fears coming forward and having discussions about their relationships or calling law enforcement or asking the courts for help because of discrimination based on their gender identity, and their sexual preferences. So the greatest predictors of violence in our culture and with intimate partner abusers is the fact that they believe their battering is justified. They have a right to do it. There's a great sense of property. This is my wife, my kids, my partner. I have a right to do what I'm going to do, and they believe they can get by with it. And quite honestly, they can, and they do. And there's very little accountability in the state of Kentucky. You can physically assault somebody black and blue beyond recognition, but as long as you don't use a weapon and there's no serious permanent injury, it's a misdemeanor. It's a misdemeanor. Batterers stay in jail on average 12 hours for a fourth-degree assault. And so for survivors, they don't see a real way out or beyond because there's very little accountability. So society, we justify it, or we give permission for that justification with lack of accountability for batters. And then they also have a lot of presence of peers and people around them who have supported their behaviors. So the different types, which is important, if survivors begin to answer yes to those questions, we have to help them understand that there's different ways that you can be exposed to batters that put you in different levels of danger. So it matters the type. Those married or engaged relationship with a pit bull batterer are the ones that you and I are going to see most frequently. They have more physical injuries. They go to the hospital more. They go to the doctor more. They're coming to doctors because they're depressed. They're anxious. They can't sleep at night. They're being, kept up. They're often reporting because they are living in stress levels that you can't, continue over a period of time without getting and reaching out for some kind of help and services. These are the batterers that's easy for us to identify. They often may have criminal records, other history of violence against partners, things like that come to light. They themselves, just like any batterer, nothing is their fault. I'm not responsible for it. But for the survivor of the pit bull, we do a much better job as a society addressing those survivors. The survivors we have a hard time with is the cobra. This is the person, and I'm not a mental health expert per se, but these are the people that you would say are mostly narcissistic, completely. They are methodical and purposeful in everything that they do. The families of these homes where there's a cobra batterer take a long time for the survivor to even identify that they are a victim of this individual, including the kids. There is a whole 20 years of research of how this batterer actually parents their children to stay loyal to the batterer over the victim, so there's no way to often win a court case or get a divorce from this individual. This individual is very perfectionistic. They're high functioning, capable. And so survivors and children are at a loss and think something must be wrong with them. Must be me that's the problem because I cannot win with this batterer. The families of a cobra do really well. Kids do really well in school, probably straight A students, overachieving. The kids we pay attention to are those one acting out and having problems. When I teach teachers, we really need to be looking for kids who are overexcelling, overachieving, perfectionistic, terrified to bring home a B because dad is not going to like having a B, and crying at your desk because they have a B. That might be the kids we need to pay attention to because the cobra batterers are the hardest to identify and the most overlooked. What I'm not going to do is spend a lot of time, but you'll have this material about the different types of abusers. What we need to know is how this plays out for survivors over a period of time. Most survivors walk day in and day with fear, and mostly it's not just fear of their batterer, but fear of the unknown. So to take a risk to leave an abusive relationship they have incredible courage just to survive it every day, but it takes a new way and a lens and support system for people to really be able to step out of that. Because once you leave doesn't mean the violence stops. And we as a society often say, you got to get out of there. You got to protect yourself and your children. Just leave, just leave, just leave. Not only does that increase your risk for physical harm, maybe even death, but beyond that, how are you going to pay the bills? And can you afford an attorney for the court system if there's children involved? And is the batterer going to quit being abusive just because the survivor leaves? Most survivors are stalked. They're intimidated. They're subtly threatened. They have, things left on their porch, dead birds at the doorstep. I had one woman who never even lived with her batterer, but when she finally broke up and tried to get away from him after 4 fourth-degree assaults, he literally decapitated her dog and put it on the top of her car like a hood ornament. They terrorize. They don't stop. Just because a survivor leaves doesn't mean they don't or that they quit experiencing the power and control of their batterer. They don't. It takes a lot of communal, societal support in order to make changes for that survivor long term and hold batterers accountable. But these are the risks to victims. Really lost a sense of self. Who are they? How did they get here? Most survivors will look at me and go, how did I end up here? Like, I didn't go into this relationship. It wasn't like this in the beginning. And most every survivor, the first question is, why did he or she do this? Like, why are they this way? It's so simple not to be this way, but not for a batterer, it's not. So most survivors don't even understand their batterers and why and how their batterers act and why it's a powerful tool for them to stay engaged in power and control. A sense of hopelessness, a terrible fear of loss of their children, and they should be afraid of that because, in all honesty, many survivors risk losing their children either through the divorce process or often the Cabinet for Family and Children may be called in, and survivors are now being deemed with failure to protect because they're living in a violent home, where we really believe that they're all victims, children and the non-offending adults, but often there's a great fear of the Cabinet and the system for losing the children. And then, of course, the ultimate fear is that of death. Trauma and symptoms are what you would assume, what I just talked about. And then we have the children exposed to survivors. So another reason to assess, even though you may not, I'm not asking you to be an expert in domestic violence. So you're getting a 30-minute, very quick update to the dynamics of what this looks like for a survivor. But for children, they're the ones that have the least voice, right? So they're the ones having to be pulled in and out of these relationships with very little understanding. And there's ways that they're directly, violently exposed. Many survivors, for those of you in the medical field, you need to know that when a survivor gets pregnant, the risk of physical injury increases dramatically. So those of you that work in that field and working with women who are pregnant, you need to always assess for intimate partner violence because the serious threat of injury increases drastically. I've had children born with broken collarbones due to abuse while she was pregnant over the years. Injury to trying to intervene. A lot of times children will get in the middle, especially older children are run risk. So if you're serving children, you got to ask them too. What's the family like? What's the house like? Have you ever been afraid in your home? Especially if you're seeing injuries, because we also know there's like a 300% increased chance for children to be abused by the abusers directly, not just the adult victim in the home, but there could be children victim beyond just witnessing. Children are prone to keep the same secrets. They learn the same lessons as their adult non-offending parent in these situations on how to keep quiet and how to cover up and how to be good. They learn the same things in order for self-preservation and safety. And then a lot of economic deprivation in order to control children, all the way up to using pets, there's a real strong connection to animal abuse and abuse in these homes. Often pets are used to manipulate the children, and if children don't behave and don't do what they're doing, then the partner or the father will, I've had several times where dogs have been starved and cats until the child behaves or gets the good grades or does what I'm told. Your dog doesn't eat until you do better. It means to control the whole situation. So you have to assess children as well as the adults. Lethality, I'm not a huge huge fan of lethality assessments overall, but I do believe all of us as professionals need to consider these things. When we realize that it might be a situation where domestic violence is occurring and is likely to occur again, we have to think about, is there children in the home? Have there been threats? Have there been incidents of strangulation? Most survivors will explain that as choking. It's not choking. You choke, it's an internal process, right? You choke on a piece of meat. Somebody wrapping their hands around your throat is not choking, it's strangulation. We know there's a high risk of strangulation. It takes very little pressure to strangle somebody to death. So most survivors, about 85%, have talked about being strangled until they've passed out before, which is terrifying because you don't know whether you're going to live or die, or the fear of being strangled. Recent separations, forced sexual activity, has the batterer ever threatened suicide or the victim ever threatened suicide, or what you're looking for. You can find danger assessments anywhere on the web that you can help provide survivors if you get them privately to do that. And then safety planning should be individualized. And lastly, in my last second, please know your local program. Call them, reach out to them. You don't have to be the expert, but connect people. Give them a safe voice to talk to, and hopefully you'll be able to really have an impact and keep people alive and safe. Thank you very much.